This is Transformation Ground Control, your source for all things business, technology, strategy, and change. If you're growing your business, leading change within your organization, or undertaking any sort of operational or technology change initiative, this podcast is for you. This show covers what you need to know about digital transformation, organizational change, operational improvement, and business growth.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
And now, here's your host, Eric Kimberling.
Hello, welcome to Transformation Ground Control. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm here with Kyler Cheatham. Kyler, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I know. Thanks for filling in for Parisa and her maternity leave absence. Welcome to the show. So good to have you.
Absolutely. It's an honor.
So we've got an exciting show for everyone today. We've got a few things we're going to cover. We're going to, first of all, we're going to start off by talking a little bit about our Digital Stratosphere Conference, which we just wrapped up recently. And we had some good audience participation at that conference, and you're going to help us maybe reenact or relive some of those moments via some of the questions that the audience had. And we're going to go through some of those topics and questions that came up during those 3 days of discussions, focusing on a few of the sessions that we had on the first day of the conference. So we'll do that here in our first segment, and then later in the show we're going to have Sarah Dokovic is going to interview Stuart Robb from our UK office, talking about the board's role in transformation. So that'll be our first guest will be Stuart and Sarah talking about how the executive board and the executive management team should be involved in a transformation, what their role is, and how they can make it successful and whatnot. And then we'll also have Sarah again interviewing Brian LaCarrubba from the Third Stage team, who's going to talk about business intelligence. So after we talk about the board's role in transformation, we'll shift gears, bring on another guest, talk about business intelligence and data and analytics and all that good stuff and how it relates to transformation. And then finally, we're actually going to play a clip from our Stratosphere conference, one of the presentations that I gave. We're going to play you a little clip from that segment or from that session. And that session is an executive summary of transformation best practices. That's a presentation I often give to not only at conferences, but to executive teams at clients. That's one of the sessions that I typically give, and we'll play you a clip from that part of Stratosphere. So stay tuned to the end for that piece of it. It's a interesting conversation. So to start though, let's talk about some of the questions that came up during the event. So we had a lot of people attend the event, a lot of good questions that came up. In fact, we couldn't get to all the questions because there were so many. But what were some of the sort of the findings or some of the questions and themes that came up during the conference?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, great job. It was an excellent conference. I know we had a lot of really great feedback. So with that, I think the thing, maybe just me that learned the most, but we had a lot of questions around change management. So I think that's probably a great place to start, as all of our topics had to do with change management and had some of that context kind of weaved in to that. So I think one of the questions I found most interesting was, do you need change management when it comes to technical upgrades? So maybe you're not doing like a full ERP digital transformation, but you are transforming or upgrading a piece of your software or a process. So do you need change management? Should it be something that is continuous throughout kind of any sort of change in your business?
Yeah, and that was an interesting topic or thread that came up during the conference, and it's a common misnomer or misperception that you don't need change management because we're simply doing an upgrade. And so first of all, I'd say that it's important to look at whether or not you're really doing a simple upgrade. I think a lot of times companies think, well, I'm already using, say SAP and I'm just upgrading to S/4HANA, or I'm already using Oracle EBS, I'm just upgrading to Oracle ERP Cloud. In today's day and age, for most vendors that are now making that shift to the cloud, where their upgrades are not a simple incremental upgrade, but it's more of a rewrite of their software, the call it upgrades, I use that term very loosely, but those upgrades are actually more like re-implementations because they're completely different products. They're just not the same. It may have some similarities, some commonalities that look familiar to people, but for the most part, these are completely new technologies. It just happens to be the same vendor that you may have used in the past. But even in cases where it might be a more incremental upgrade, where perhaps it's a vendor that's already in the cloud and they've got a pretty mature product, and so it's not as big of a jump as some of the other vendors are making, it's still usually more disruptive from an organizational change perspective than people think. And so I'd say that change management is important no matter what sort of, transformation you're going through, whether it's an upgrade or a re-implementation of an entirely new product. But so that's the first thing to note, is that it's important either way. But I think even more importantly, in most cases, we find that these upgrades are more significant than people think. So yeah, long way of saying that yes, change management is important.
Is important. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in taking it kind of up a level, we had a huge global audience, right, at Stratosphere. And that's a big piece of the identity of Third Stage, right, is having that ability to transcend any sort of cultural barriers or anything like that. So we did have a great question from one of our participants in South Africa asking about how does culture affect the system integrator you work with, the vendor, the partners you choose. How do you make sure that from a change management perspective, if you have different departments in different areas, if you have any sort of global footprint, how do you make sure that you are taking that into consideration when it comes to your projects?
Yeah, and it's a great question because most people don't think about culture when they're thinking about a transformation. So just the fact that the question came up is a great start to begin with. And it was also interesting that embedded in that question in the first part is, how does it affect the vendors that you might work with? And I think that's an important thing, is when you're defining your digital strategy or your software selection, it's important to look at not only how well software does or doesn't meet your tangible business requirements, but you also want to look at it from an intangible perspective of how well aligned that technology or solution is or isn't with your organization. So just to give maybe a quick oversimplified example, if you look at SAP versus Oracle, or let's just say even better, SAP versus Microsoft Dynamics. Let's just say those are two products you're considering, SAP S4HANA and Microsoft Dynamics 365. Those are two pretty extreme examples of SAP S4HANA being more of the standardized, common business process operating model type of solution that's somewhat rigid, for better or for worse, and maybe less flexible than other products in the market. And then you have D365, which is sort of the opposite. It's very flexible, for better or for worse, which has a dark side as well. But it's not as robust in terms of driving that sort of standardization and common business process model. So neither one's necessarily good or bad or right or wrong, but when you look at your organization and who you are and what you're trying to become, you want to look at how would that solution affect your culture. So, for example, when you're implementing SAP S4HANA, a lot of organizations that make that jump to SAP, they do it because they want to scale, they want to standardize, they want to create common business processes and integrated processes across the company. But then they fail to recognize what a big disruption that is to their culture, because maybe they grew up as an entrepreneurial, shoot from the hip type of organization, and now you're sort of forcing them pretty quickly into a different model where it's a lot more rigid. And so that's the first thing, is looking more on the evaluation and the roadmap side of it, is what is that impact and how does the technology fit in or not with your vision for what you want your culture to be. And then when you look at the implementation and the transformation itself, and that's where you get into the questions of different cultures in different countries and how you navigate that, and recognize that the bigger you are and the more complex you are and the more multinational you are, the more cultural clashes or misalignments you're likely to have. And so I think the key there is just really to do an assessment early on, an organizational assessment that looks at the different parts of the organization. Even if you're not multinational, you could still have different cultures or subcultures within the same division or the same part of your business or the same country of your business. And certainly for multinational, that becomes even more important. So doing that sort of organizational assessment to understand what the culture is now, what are the pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses, what is it we're trying to bend the culture to become, and then ultimately how do we create a change strategy that meets those needs. So that's easier said than done. There's a lot more to it than that, but that
Right.
in a nutshell is sort of what we would recommend to clients that are trying to figure out the cultural piece of it.
Definitely. And we did have a session at Stratosphere on global transformations as well. So that's definitely something that we are able to cover. And if our audience has any more questions, we can certainly dig into that as well. But last question on change management that I thought was really interesting, and I know Stuart's going to kind of talk about the importance of executive alignment and the role of the board later today. But I thought, this more kind of technical question about how do you budget for change management, or what piece of your budget from transformation should be centered on change management because it's so important. And I've never really heard it talked about in really that more technical, hard, quantitative terms. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was a great question that I didn't have a good metric for, or any sort of proven data, proven sources that demonstrate what that budget should be. So again, it's another question that just the fact that the question's coming up is a good one, because it means you're thinking about how much should we budget on something that's very important. But one thing we found, and this again isn't based on any sort of scientific data, but just as qualitatively speaking, when we look at where the more successful organizations that we've worked with over the years, where have they invested, or how much have they invested in change management? It's been, somewhere between like 15 and 17% seems to be a number that, just order of magnitude from our perspective, is a good, benchmark or place to think about or to start. It's not a hard and fast metric by any means, but I think it's a good order of magnitude thing to figure out directionally, are we investing enough in change management? I think what happens is a lot of times we sort of try to take leftover budget to figure out how we're going to, bake in some change management just to get some bare minimum focus on it. But I think in the budgeting process, you should be spending more time up front saying, okay, we want to have a robust change management strategy and plan, and we want to invest heavily in this. So let's make sure we define that plan and have a budget for it. What I would say, maybe building on the previous question you asked around the cultural piece of it, and how during the organizational assessment, that's where you really assess what the cultural impact is and how you want to bend the culture. Same holds true for the budgeting piece, because when you do the organizational assessment, that gives you a sense of, how big of an impact is this going to be to the organization, and how much ultimately do we need to invest.
Yeah, I think that it all kind of weaves together was a huge learning on my part, and someone, that's not in the industry all the time. And the thing about change management, which kind of like trickles into my next question, is we had Marcus Harris from Taft Law join us for more of the contracting type of questions. And I was so surprised of how much change management he actually spoke about and how important that is in contracting. So my next question kind of focuses on that, and how we kind of we rack in users. So that was the piece that I know a lot of people had questions on. And when we are going through the contracting piece and testing and implementation, one of our audience members wanted to kind of dig into, at what point do you involve users in this actual project? So that was one piece that I never really thought about. I thought, probably just the IT team would do it, and then they would kind of just tell everybody about it. But I learned from Marcus can really lead to failure if you don't involve users in the actual, planning and testing process.
Yeah, it's definitely true. And I think to your point about Marcus recognizing the importance of change management, being an attorney who deals with failures and lawsuits all the time, and he's seeing these extreme examples of failure. And the good part about that perspective that he has, and we have as well, just from being expert witnesses on his cases and other attorneys' cases, is that you get to see sort of front row what not to do. And change management, in every expert witness case I've been involved with, change management's been a huge issue. And so I think that's an important point. But as far as how the how you create that buy-in and make sure it's not an IT-driven project or whatever. It's a good point. You definitely want the business stakeholders involved. It's a tricky balancing act though, because you on one hand you don't want it to be a small group of people or just the IT group making these decisions and running the project. You want the business to be involved. But the more people you get involved, on the flip side, the more people you get involved, the harder it is to get consensus and alignment on what it is you're going to do. So you definitely don't want to just ignore it and say, well, then we'll just have a smaller group, from IT driving the whole thing, and that way we don't have to worry about it, because then you have other issues with resistance to the change. But I think that's a key thing, or key balance. We actually have a client that we're working with now that has, I think the number is like 82. There's 82 different people from their project team that are stakeholders or been identified as stakeholders that have to have input into this decision and the overall roadmap. And so that the good news is they have a lot of buy-in, a lot of involvement. They're all involved in it. But the hard part is they're having a lot of trouble, and we're having trouble just kind of getting them all aligned and recognizing that you're not going to make everyone happy. It's not going to be a unanimous decision-making process. And someone's going to be unhappy, with some of the decisions that are made. So you have to just acknowledge the messiness of that. Maybe you aren't going to have 82 people on your project or involved in these sorts of things, but it just goes back to that balancing act. You do want the involvement. It's going to create some messiness, but you need to do it to some degree to work through that stuff.
Yeah. And how do you identify those users, or like, is there some sort of assessment or something like that you utilize to say, like, this department or this stakeholder needs to be involved?
Yeah, I mean, typically, when we're helping structure the team, you want to make sure you've got a good cross-functional representation and a cross-geographical representation and that sort of thing. So, part of it comes out of that organizational assessment that I was talking about before. A lot of times the clients themselves, they kind of know who some of the key stakeholders are that they want to include, and then it's a matter of just sort of filling out the team. And then other times, I'm not saying this is the right answer, but other times it's sort of the squeaky wheels, the people that are very vocal, that have very strong opinions, they end up just by default becoming part of the decision-making process, and that may or may not be the right answer in those cases. And, it is okay, too. The other thing is it's okay to say no, that not everyone can be involved in the whole, every single decision that gets made or every single step in the process. And that's hard for organizations as well, especially, flatter organizations, more collaborative organizations. They tend to struggle to get that alignment and consensus, and and you have to factor those sorts of things into your transformation plan too, because that stuff's going to move a lot slower than the technological rollout is going to.
Yeah, definitely. That makes a lot of sense. So it's kind of hard to ask you questions about this specific conference because we covered so much, right? So for our audience, we are kind of pivoting a little bit, but I know we had a lot of discussion around ERP cloud and the cloud in general and what that means as far as implementing softwares, because it seems as though the industry obviously has taken a real turn towards those systems. So one of the questions that we had when we did discuss these different pieces is just, what does that implementation look like? How is it different? And what is the timeline around the cloud implementation, if that's what you choose to utilize for your business?
Yeah, so first of all, it's important to not be lulled into thinking that it's going to be easy and it's going to be super fast because it's a cloud deployment. As we just talked about with the cultural pieces of things and the buy-in, that's the stuff that cloud isn't going to speed up for us. The cloud deployments might make technology more accessible, and it might make the technology, or it might get it up and running faster, the technology itself. But getting the technology to work with our business and to align it with our business processes and vice versa, and to align it with our organization and vice versa, that's the part that takes time. So, and that's a bulk of the time and effort that goes into an implementation. So on one hand, yes, cloud does positively affect implementation time and cost and risk, I guess you could say. But it's a very narrow part of the project that it's affecting, and it's overstated usually by vendors how much of an impact that has on the overall implementation. So I can't give you a hard and fast number of like how quickly can you implement cloud versus on-premise. Honestly, I haven't seen any sort of material difference in a cloud rollout versus a on-premise. Take that for what it's worth. But if you're going with a more agile approach, or you're trying to roll out incrementally more different technologies, cloud can definitely support that approach for sure.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Certainly, I know we had lots of conversations around implementation and how do you prepare for an implementation. I think one of the sessions I learned the most from was how do you tighten up your operations to make sure that you're ready for an implementation, or even just how do you make sure that you're utilizing your data to choose a software. So I thought this question during Dave Beldick's session about operations was really interesting when he talked about the go live and what the preparation was before that. And so one of our users asked if the system's not ready for the go live, how can the operational pieces be implemented if they're not exactly connected to the go live? So how can the data, or how can you make sure that your data is cleansed, or that you're ready to go as far as different pieces that the organization itself needs to own, even though you might have an advisor or a partner like Third Stage helping you kind of through that?
Yeah, and it's another intuitive question. It was a good question from the audience. Just to be thinking in that way is very important. But I'd say that first of all, that not all, contrary to popular belief, not all process improvements are fully dependent on new technology. There's certainly ways that technology is going to help you further enable improvements you want to make, or give you the tools to further automate or make a process more efficient, more effective. But there's oftentimes, somewhere between a third or half of the process improvements that you want to make, you could do without the technology. It might be made even better with the technology, but you could start changing the way you think about things, or the way information flows, or the way people start incorporating steps in their processes. It may be that it's fairly manual for the time being, but it's still an improvement. It's an incremental improvement. And then by the time the technology gets rolled out, maybe it's a even further improvement in that area. So I think that's an important way to think about it, because it allows you to get value out of these improvements even before you're waiting for the big go live, which might be years down the road. You can be incorporating some of these changes now, and then also what the benefit is that it allows you to get to a point where you've already made some change, so you're not springing all the change on people right at go live, or when they get to testing, they're not learning about this stuff for the first time. They've already incorporated some of the changes into their day-to-day processes. They've changed their operating procedures. Now it's a matter of using a new tool to help further enable that improvement. So that's the way. It's not that you necessarily want to decouple process improvement from technology, but there's a subset of it that you can definitely be rolling out from a operational value perspective, and also from a change management perspective, to sort of spoon feed the changes a little bit more gradually to people, rather than all at one big bang go live point.
Yeah, definitely. I think that having that specifically for our small businesses or our small to medium businesses, where would you start? And just saying that I know I have things to do on the operation side, and even for global businesses, do you start by reaching out to a partner to help you through that process, or do you start by, looking at your data, or what's kind of the first step in that process?
Yeah, so I mean, if you don't have much experience in the area, I would say definitely get some outside help. Companies like Third Stage, ideally, that are independent and aren't aligned or affiliated with software vendors that can give you objective advice. That's always good to have. But as far as how you get started, even with a partner, I mean, the first thing is really just to assess what you have and where the pain points are, what the priorities are as an organization, and evaluate options from there. I mean, there's so many different options you have as an organization, especially a smaller business. There's just tons of different technologies that can support whatever industry you're in. And so, making sure that you do that assessment up front is important. And it doesn't need to be a super extensive, over analysis of your current state, but you do want to get some sort of lay of the land to get a good feel for, what you have today, where the pain points are, what you're trying to accomplish in the future, and then what path best would support that from a technology and process and people perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, going back to that more strategy mindset, right? When it comes to what do you want to be when you grow up, and then start from there. It always seems like we it's cyclical, right? That goes back to the first step in whatever we talk about. And my last question that I'd love you to answer for this audience specifically is, we talked about a lot of trends in the first day. We did, New Frontiers with Stuart Robb, and then you talked about trends for the 2020s for digital transformation. And one of our users asked, what do you think will be the biggest trend for digital transformation in the 2020s? So huge question, but I thought this was a good way to kind of round out our question and answer session here, is just letting you kind of talk about that, those new trends and pieces of the overall industry and business.
Yeah, you don't by chance remember what I said in the conference, do you? When they asked that question, because I don't remember how I answered that question.
I think you kind of packaged it up in all of the things that you had talked about, but maybe just giving us a kind of a quick hit of trends that you've been seeing, or calls you've been getting from clients, or anything like that. Kind of, where are we headed as an industry, and what does that look like, especially after all we've experienced globally in the last couple of years?
Yeah, I think in general, if you look purely at the technology trends themselves, probably the biggest one we're seeing with business applications and enterprise technologies and ERP systems and whatnot is in the space of machine learning and artificial intelligence. So really, just finding ways to make sense of your data and translating it into something that helps the business beyond just basic reporting, helping you make decisions or helping a workflow be more automated, simply because you have data that the system can analyze and help automate based on historic trends and whatnot. It's an area that I feel like the ERP and enterprise technology space has been talking about for a long time, but we're just now finally seeing some new capabilities in that area of machine learning and artificial intelligence. We're still not, ERP systems still aren't caught up to the to the machine learning and algorithmic type of capabilities of a Google or Amazon or one of those tech providers that have machine learning and AI sort of baked into their core product, but they're getting there. They're starting to find ways to use machine learning and artificial intelligence. So I think that is a big thing. There's a lot of buzz around it. Technology's starting to bake that into it as well.
Right. And for anyone that's listening that's not, familiar with that, I highly recommend they go check out your video and blog. I have the pleasure of being able to edit those blogs. And one thing that really resonated with me was, Alexa, right? We all know. My son knows, he's 2. He knows that name. And I always go back and forth, like, I want to teach him to be polite, but I also want him to know that that's not actually a real person. And, we have these new frontiers, not only from the business angle, but also the personal angle as well. So, but thank you so much for answering these questions. And I know we will kind of provide a snapshot of Digital Stratosphere in the end of this episode, right?
Yep. We'll play you a little clip about just sort of an executive summary of best practices in transformation. So that was one of the clips we did on the first day of keynotes that we'll play for you at the end of this session here. Yeah, well, good. Well, thanks for bringing up those questions. It was good to sort of summarize and replay some of the highlights of the conference, and people can download or access at least the first day of the conference on our website, right? As far as
Yep.
if they want to access any of those keynotes.
Yep, absolutely. We can access those on our website as well, and that's all of day one. It's also going to be up on our YouTube channel too, so we can kind of splice it out per section. Yep,
and we'll include a link in this podcast description just to make sure you have access or you know how to get there. But be sure to look out for that. There are really good speakers on that first day. A lot of good topics covered, so I highly encourage you to check that out. So, well, good. Well, thanks for that discussion there, and we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to bring back Stuart Robb, who's going to talk a bit about the executive's role in a transformation. So we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm here with Cheatham, and we are talking today about a lot of different topics. We talked about our Stratosphere conference right before the break, and now we're going to shift gears and bring back one of our Stratosphere speakers, which is Stuart Robb, who's going to talk about the executive's role and the board of directors' role in transformation. And this is a really important topic, even if you're not an executive team member or if you're not on a board of directors, because it's a way to set expectations and help your executive team understand what their role should be. And that's a common disconnect we see in transformations is sort of the project team knows what needs to be done, or maybe they have a better understanding of what's required of the executive team, but the board or executive team has a different idea of what their role should or shouldn't be. So this is a topic that I know you've heard Stuart speak about. Kyler, what are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this topic is so interesting, and it kind of comes back to what we were talking about earlier of what is the overall strategic goal of the business and how important it is that the project team is aligned with the executive team so that everyone's kind of on the same page. And Stuart did a really interesting presentation, just so our audience knows, at his business breakfast for his European audience in February. So that's also available on our YouTube channel if anyone wants to check that out. But with this, he kind of utilized the podcast to talk through that. So one of the most interesting things, most interesting baseline questions is, when you take this to the board, I've seen that be a pain point in getting through that. Can you kind of take us through what that looks like, or how to attach the actual project proposal to the board, and maybe share a best practice about that relationship?
Yeah, first of all, you want to set the cadence and the tempo and the process for how you communicate and keep the board involved or the executive team involved and up to speed on what's going on. So setting that tempo early on is important, and setting the expectation early on is important. But then it's also a matter of, educating the board and the executive team on what their role should be and what sorts of decisions that are going to get escalated to them. So it becomes sort of a project governance discussion or topic. So that's the other thing, is just the governance and the decision-making process, and making sure they're on the same page with that. So that when you do bring a proposal or you bring a recommendation to them, they're not surprised by it, or they don't tell you just to deal with it. They know that they're expected to, be part of that process, and make sure they at the very least validate and buy into the recommendations or whatever decision is that's being made. I think the thing that's just as important too is that, project teams, for understandable self-preservation purposes or reasons, will sugarcoat the way things are going oftentimes, and it's not that you want to point out all the deficiencies of what you're doing or what the transformation is going through, but you want to be very candid and transparent about the risks that are being mitigated or that are bubbling under the surface, and identifying ways that the executive team can help mitigate those risks. So those are some of the things that come to mind in that regard.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that this is such an important topic, right? Because the board ultimately, usually in most organizations, are the decision maker, really, about can we invest this huge amount of money in a new system? So I think Stuart has a lot of great insight in how to make sure that your proposal is ready and understand what their relationship is, whether you're on the project team or you are a board member or an executive that's trying to support the project team.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and he has a pretty interesting perspective that we'll get to here now, just from dealing with so many executive teams, and he obviously uses humor very well in his descriptions of things and best practices. So this will be a good conversation. So with that, we'll bring in Sarah Dokovich, who will run the interview here with Stuart. Sarah and Stuart, we'll turn it over to you.
Oftentimes, the lines can be blurry as to the role the board of directors plays in a digital transformation journey. Stuart Robb is here today to share his insights on the value that key company stakeholders bring to the table in ensuring a software implementation is successful. Stuart is the Vice President of Third Stage Consulting Europe, an independent and technology-agnostic digital transformation consulting firm. He and his team have worked with some of the world's leading organizations in their digital transformation journeys and have helped many organizations, both local and international, transform their digital landscape successfully. Stuart, thank you for joining us today.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm very well. Hopefully you're well as well. Now, I'm curious about the dynamics of digital transformation when it comes to the role that the board plays. So how involved do you typically see a board of directors being for the clients you've worked with and helped throughout a digital transformation?
I think it is true to say it varies a lot from company to company. And I think as well it depends on what the board structure is, particularly if you've got a CEO who is also the chairman. You tend to find that other board members, the executive C-suite members, will be involved, but the NEDs maybe not so much. Whereas if you're in a PLC or a a Fortune 500 company, where those roles are changed and the board chairman and the CEO are separated, you tend to find that the board want a bit more information. They're a bit more inquisitive. So there's no real single answer. I've tended to find that in a lot of SME organizations, the board tend to demur the ERP transformations to the operational and the operational issues that arise from that to the C-suite execs. Whereas again, in larger companies, they tend to want to find out more and they tend to want their own information. So it really depends on board to board.
Awesome. And are the transformation projects more or less successful when the board is actively involved in the process?
I think the answer is yes. I mean, I think it goes back again to how that board is structured. I mean, the board is there not only to measure the C-suite's progress towards developing the strategy and growing the company, but the board's other role is to foresee risk and to help work with the C-suites to mitigate that risk. And so given the profile of ERPs as being a high cost investment that's fraught with risk, you'll find some organizations where the board get very proactively involved and want to know the detail, and then others where the board is more passive, and if they get any update about it at all, are getting a very thin slice of what's really going on. And in fact, I mean, that's one of the things, we'll talk about it a little bit later about the business breakfast, but that's one of the things that we wanted to explore a little bit in more detail, is how different organizations see the role of the board in terms of their accountability for the success of an ERP, especially given the amount of money that these things cost. I mean, 5 or 6% of annual revenue spent on an ERP implementation is a significant block of money off the shareholder returns. And if it all gets written off, then the shareholders usually have something difficult to say about it. So I think one of the other areas as well, I've tended to find actually that private equity take a much more interventionist and a much closer to ERP implementations. And obviously they are represented on the board. So again, it depends on the type of company structure. You can go into a large PLC and never meet a board member and as a senior on an ERP program. But most of the ones where I've been involved with private equity, they want to speak to you, and they want to speak to you quite regularly. So it really does depend on the kind of organization.
Fair, yeah. And what can the board do to ensure an ERP and or digital transformation doesn't fail?
Well, I think, again, this is one of the things we want to do on the 26th, is just get some experiences from C-suites and from non-execs to have that sort of discussion. I mean, I have my own hypothesis, which is that the more inquisitive a board is, especially some of the non-execs who are there to help and advise the board, the more people and the more experience you're sharing that knowledge with, and therefore the more likely you are to see a problem coming. And it's not exclusively, but there are always warning signs in an ERP, even early on, that it's going to go off track. And so, the board's participation and the board's inquisitiveness in how that's going and what's happening, and offering, advice, support, it's one end of the scale. And then the other end of the scale, I've seen in a couple of organizations, they do formal risk analysis. So the board actually, it's not the C-suite, the board appoints an independent assurer, and that assurance company comes in once a month, once every 4 months, 3 months, or whatever it is, and they provide an independent assurance of report that goes precisely to the board, and the board look at that in the same way they would look at the audit results or the recommendations from the remuneration committee, kept at arm's length from the executive operation of the company. So there are lots of options, and there's lots of there's a big span of how these things work.
Yeah. So basically, based on what you're saying, the board and other key company stakeholders alike play a huge role in the success of a digital transformation.
Well, it's that they're the people that are doing the work, to safeguard the shareholders and the investors' investment in the firm. So if the company is making a big investment like an ERP or a digital transformation and the board aren't involved, my question would be, why not?
Yeah, absolutely. And I believe that you're going to be talking about this more in depth at the Digital Transformation Business Breakfast coming up in just a couple of weeks too, right?
Yes, we are on the 26th of February.
Awesome. We'll look forward to that as well. So when we come back from a quick break, Stuart and I are going to discuss the matter of the board's presence in a software implementation in a little bit more detail.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstageconsulting.com.
Welcome back to the Digital Stratosphere podcast. I'm Sarah Durkovich, speaking with Stuart Robb from Third Stage Consulting, discussing the true role the board of directors plays during a company's digital transformation. So various blogs and videos the Third Stage team has put out have stressed the importance of executive alignment. So does getting alignment from the board of directors fall into this category, or is this the approach and significance of getting the board's alignment differ in any way from getting alignment from, say, the C-suite?
Yeah, it's a good question, and actually even getting alignment in the C-suite can sometimes be pretty tricky. I remember a ERP that I was working on a number of years ago, and we always had tricky relationship, shall I say, with the head of customer services, and we could never figure out why until I happened to stumble upon the fact that he was goal aligned and his bonus was completely diametrically opposite to the goals of the transformation that we were doing. And so he was quasi supportive because he needed to be seen to be supportive. But if we were successful, his bonus pool would actually go down. And of course, once I found that out and we had that discussion with the CEO, we were able to put in place a package that fixed that. But those things can be pretty tricky to unpick. And then when you add a layer of politics over the top of that as well, who likes who doesn't like who, getting that even executive alignment can be a bit of a minefield. I actually think that the board, in terms of the board of directors, is slightly different. If that oversight role is working well and that support role is working well, then the board will always be challenging and supporting the C-suite execs to implement the strategy, and therefore their support and their challenge should be the same for an ERP initiative as it is for any other big strategy play that the C-suite execs might suggest, if it's an acquisition or if it's a divestment or anything else. I see digital transformation is in the same category of change. But again, it goes back to what I said a little bit earlier, which is around the role of the board and how that functions tends to be different in every company. And you'll find large companies have a much bigger separation of board and executive C-suites, whereas some of the smaller ones don't. So a well-functioning board, will take an interest in the initiative because it is a big investment, and they will challenge and support in equal measure.
Awesome. Thank you for clarifying that. Now, I wanted to ask you about this business breakfast. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, so there's an awful lot of misinformation going around the market about what digital transformation is and what to expect from it. And even the word digital transformation is much abused by lots of different people. And the other thing that I've tended to find is that I tend to come across two types of senior leader or board director. One who has done an ERP, who thought it was an absolute horror story and never ever wants to do one again. And the other who's never had the horror story of having done an ERP and doesn't really know what they are. Mm-hmm. So I thought there was an opportunity for us to get out a little bit and evangelize, but also to explain what leading practice thinking is on ERP, how board members can get involved and give them a bit of information about the current topics and the current issues in ERP, but also give them the opportunity to discuss with their own colleagues and peers, their experiences, any of their key learnings, what worked for them, what doesn't work, so that you're kind of building a little community of senior executives who have a point of view on ERP. So in April, for example, so this one is around the board's role in ERP and how to make it successful and what to watch out for. April, we're doing one on frontier technologies and what the barriers to adoption are. So things like artificial intelligence, and I know a lot of people are talking about that, but there are actually a lot of use cases for AI at the moment. So we'll talk a little bit about, what's the real truth behind adoption in artificial intelligence and machine learning and those kind of frontier technologies. And then March, we're doing one on ERP due diligence. April, we're doing one on ERP due diligence for private equity acquisitions. Or mostly private equity, but in fact, any company that's considering investing in in acquiring another company, what are the things that you should watch out for in looking at their technology architecture and their technology stack, and what are the red flags that you should watch out for. So we got 11 of these lined up, so that's just the sort of the rest of the quarter, what we're planning on doing with those.
That's awesome. And it sounds like a really great opportunity to not only learn more about an important topic, but also to network with other leaders in the industry. So how can our listeners register for this event?
Well, so very simple. If you're a C-suite exec or a board level director, the easiest way to register is to drop an email to events@thirdstage-consulting.com, which hopefully by the magic of technology will appear somewhere down the bottom, or maybe up the top, or who knows where it's going to be. The easiest way is to email that address. We will then send you back a web link with a registration form, and you'll get a link for Zoom a little bit nearer the event. It's the 26th of February. It's mostly aimed at Europe because it's very early in the morning for the US. So we're starting at 8 a.m. in Europe, but if any US C-suite or non-exec colleagues would like to join it at 10 o'clock at night, they are very, very, very welcome. So that's 8 a.m. London, 9 a.m. Central European time. And we are limiting the spaces on this just because we want to keep the sessions interactive and stimulate a conversation. And of course, you find you've got 500 people on. People tend not to say anything at all. So book early for Christmas.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. And we're about out of time, but I wanted to thank you so much for being here today and for sharing these powerful insights with us today.
No problem at all. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you. And I wanted to thank all of you for listening today as well. Again, my name is Sarah Durkovic. And we'll see you next time on our next episode of the Digital Stratosphere podcast.
All right. Thank you, Stuart and Sarah. I appreciate that. That's a great conversation on a very important topic that is hopefully helpful to the audience here and really understanding what the board's role and the executive team's role is in transformation, or at least what it should be in transformation. So we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to shift gears and talk about business intelligence. We're going to bring Sarah back, but she's going to have a new guest, Brian LaCarrubba from the Third Stage team, who's going to talk about business intelligence and what it means and how it fits into transformation. We'll get to that when we come back with more from Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Hey, feeling good, like I should. When in darker, walk around the neighborhood, feeling blessed.
Hello and welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. I'm here with Kyler Cheatham. You can find the podcast every Wednesday. We go live on YouTube. You can also find us every Wednesday on all the popular podcast platforms, Apple, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, iHeartRadio, whatever podcast platform you use, we're probably on it. So be sure to subscribe there, give us a review, and share it with your friends as well, or your colleagues. So we're going to shift gears here and talk about business intelligence. We're going to have Brian LaCarrubba from our team, from the Third Stage team here, talk with Sarah about business intelligence. Now, is this an area that you know much about, Kyler, or do you hear a lot about this in the marketing work that you're doing?
I hear a lot about it. I know absolutely nothing about it. Brian LaCarrubba is one of my favorite people to work with here at Third Stage, just because he has that technical mind. When I asked him a question, he's like, but what does that actually mean? And I'm like, I don't know. So, I think he's a great stakeholder to talk to this. But when it comes to business intelligence, if you could just define the word or the term, I think that's a great place to start because it's so heavy and technical.
Yeah, it is, and I guess a way to maybe simplify it would be to, think of it as reporting on steroids, analytics and reporting on steroids. So you take sort of your, historically, when you think of business intelligence, you'd think, okay, well, I'm just going to run a report that tells me what my P&L is or what my, inventory levels are, or inventory discrepancies, whatever, report you want. This is business intelligence nowadays. It really takes it a step further and augments that view of the world with more of a perspective of what can we do with the data we have to make information out of it, and also to help make decisions, and in some cases automate some decisions, or to at the very least queue up the data we need to make more informative decisions. So it's really just an understanding of taking these masses of data that get captured every day in your ERP system or any organization's enterprise technology, and compiling it and putting it together in a way that actually makes sense and helps you make decisions and drive the business forward.
Yeah, and Eric, where does this fit in a digital transformation? Is it supporting? Does it play a main role, or where should the focus be for any sort of business transformation project in regards to business intelligence?
Well, it shouldn't be. I'll tell you what it should not be. It should not be a afterthought that comes at the end of a project. It's sort of the necessary evil, like, oh yeah, we've got to figure out all our reports now and figure out how we're going to configure that. That's where it should not be. But more specifically, where it should be is, pulling that forward and really clearly defining how, first of all, what kind of information are you missing now as an organization? So, that's a good place to start, to say, what if you just forget about the technology and what it can or can't do, and just look at what information would you like to have to be able to make decisions and to be able to better understand your business and that sort of thing. That's usually a really good place to start, because usually organizations and teams have these gaps and deficiencies in their current business intelligence or reporting environment. But beyond that, then you can also look at what are some of the sort of boilerplate or off-the-shelf, out-of-the-box sorts of reports or dashboards or analytics that the technology provides. Maybe that'll give me some ideas as well. So usually when you put those two things together, what you think you want to have that you don't have, and there's probably reports you already have that you want to maintain, but then also look at what you could be getting out of the system, put that together, and that usually gives you sort of a roadmap or a vision of what you could be doing from a BI perspective.
Right. So kind of going back to that more operation data focused conversation that we had earlier about, kind of cleaning up your side of the street before you are going into any sort of implementation. And it sounds like, there's a lot of OCM involved in this, organizational change management too, when it comes to creating automations as well.
Yeah.
So definitely really important to kind of keep everything parallel pathed, I would assume, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And get ahead of it too, spend time up front doing that stuff, even though there's a lot of other things you want to be doing or should be doing as well. You also want to make sure you don't lose sight of this thread.
Yeah, definitely. And then again, just to reference a blog for someone that has no, background in business intelligence, Brian LaCarrubba wrote a blog on that and gave a really interesting example about payroll system automation. And I felt like that was a great way to kind of simplify what does actually business intelligence mean. So for anyone looking for more really baseline information like myself, feel free to check that out, because that was really, it really outlined it perfectly for me.
Yeah. And so, speaking of Brian and resources related to business intelligence, let's cut over to Sarah and Brian now, and we'll bring back Sarah Dokovic again, and she'll run this interview here with Brian LaCarrubba about business intelligence. So we'll turn it over to you, Sarah and Brian.
Today we have Third Stage Consulting Group's Brian LaCarrubba on the show with us to discuss the importance of business intelligence. We'll be talking about how to use business intelligence tools to avoid digital transformation failure and ultimately drive DTP success. As most of you know by now, Third Stage Consulting Group is an independent and technology agnostic digital transformation consulting firm. They have guided hundreds of organizations through their transformation journeys. And Brian, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me, Sarah.
Absolutely. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with a little business intelligence 101, as some of our listeners may not be familiar with that term. So let's break down the term business intelligence. Can you give me like a quick definition of business intelligence? Is it like more to it than a buzzword like machine learning and artificial intelligence, or where does it come into play for a typical organization?
Yes, it is much more than those buzzwords for sure. At its most basic level, BI is just about how an organization manages and uses its data. It's one of its critical assets, and it should be going much beyond the way that organizations have traditionally done it to be able to get insights into how you need to conduct business. It's really taking your raw data and turning it into actionable information. That's really the key, making it actionable. And organizations usually start with a tool we don't think of as a BI tool, but it's Excel. That is BI at its most basic and simple. And there's a lot more you need to do than Excel to have an effective BI program, but that is encapsulates the basic concepts of being able to take that data you use in an organization and turn it into something that your users can use to make decisions.
Awesome, cool. And business intelligence has everything to do with data, like keeping track of it, managing it, and also learning from it. But how does business intelligence differ from data analytics and reporting? Do those two kind of go hand in hand?
They absolutely go hand in hand. And the relationships between the terms, to me, the overlaps are more important than the distinctions between them. So if we look at the importance of reporting, it's a critical element of BI about being able to take data and present it in formats to an end user, to an employee that are going to help them to make decisions, and being able to pull that out in a way that can help them. Data analytics is a critical skill set as well. In your organization, you need to be able to have the capabilities to know what your data is telling you, how to use it, how to analyze it, and make important decisions that you need to make based on it. But the other element of business intelligence we really need to be thinking about is the strategic area of how do you plan your data? How do you make sure you're capturing the things that you need and building your processes around the data that you're going to have accessible so that your business can run your operations and align your activities and business processes around the data that you have and actually use that to improve your performance.
Okay, awesome. And what is dirty data, and how does that affect an organization's business intelligence efforts?
So dirty data is a major problem in business intelligence efforts. It encompasses so many ways in which data can be incomplete or inaccurate, and it can really work against your program and your goals. Without a foundation of clean data, you may end up having your efforts could hurt you more than they help in a lot of ways. You could be making the wrong decisions based on the wrong information. So you may have sales data that has different definitions of sales that vary between parts of the organization, or you may be missing data for certain regions or products that are giving you an impression of your organization that's incorrect, and you may be allocating resources the wrong way, making decisions on where you want to focus your energies based on wrong information, and actually go down a wrong path if you don't have clean data. So addressing the causes of dirty data and building in the mechanisms to eliminate it and support you as an organization is one of the most critical aspects.
Oh, wow. I had no idea. So I love how perfectly you explained it too. So that's awesome. And when it comes to digital transformation, it seems like organizations either will succeed or fail with no middle ground in between them. So in what ways does a business intelligence make it easier for a digital transformation project to succeed?
So at its heart, a digital transformation program is really it's not about technology. It's about changing the behaviors of an organization. And you need to be able to use technology and take advantage of the technology to do that. But the technology itself isn't what solves your problems. It is about putting your people in a position to make the right decisions and serve your customers in the right way. So your business intelligence program is really about being able to get the right data in front of the right people at the right time in a way that lets them do things differently. Because even if they have the most advanced technology in the world, if people don't have access to what they need to know to use that correctly and to make decisions based on the way things are, you'll either end up doing things the way you used to do them with an expensive system that's not getting you there, or you may end up with even more problems as an organization if you're just failing to try to adapt your processes and do what you need to do. So the business intelligence efforts are really going to be about helping you get the right data to the right people and help them make the right decisions they need to make to take advantage of that technology.
Okay, makes sense. And what are the pitfalls that come with implementing business intelligence tools, and how can organizations do their best to avoid this type of failure?
So one of the biggest ones we just talked about a moment ago is dirty data, and making sure that you have a data governance program in place that's going to help to manage that. And it's not as if it's an ever growing and evolving effort as an organization. So if you don't have anything in place on day one, you want to start by getting some structure around that and making sure that you start building some definition around how are you going to assign the right people to be overseeing your data, and make sure that the problems that are going to creep into data over time are prevented and dealt with, and that you're able to keep your data in a clean place. So the data is really at the core of your business intelligence effort, so you need to put that focus in up front. Another area too, a little bit downstream from the data, is then going to touch on your business processes and how they're making use of the insights that you get out of business intelligence. So again, this ties into the previous answer around it's changing the behaviors of the organization. So if you think of technology as solving a business need on its own, if you put the right data in front of people and make it available to them, it's just going to automatically change their behaviors. That's going to cause you a lot of problems, because you're not going to help people see the way they need to operate differently and evolve their practices in order to take advantage of things. So those are two of the big pitfalls that organizations really need to focus on.
Yeah, no, those two are super, super important. And I wanted to ask you, maybe could you give us some examples of how business intelligence tools are being used in the market today? So which brands, products are the most well known?
Yeah, so the BI market is not necessarily dominated by individual players as much as you might see in, say, the ERP market, but you do see some leaders in the field. So Tableau is one of the biggest and best known. It's now owned by Salesforce, and Tableau really got their start through really powerful and easy to create visualizations, and that's still a strength, and they're starting to expand more into other aspects around the data storage and ability to tap into multiple data sources. SAP, still a big player in business intelligence with their business objects suite. Microsoft is definitely a big player. They have the Power BI suite, which is the very easy to use. You can almost think of it in many ways as the next evolution of Excel, and of powerful reporting tools, and of being able to put things in a very user-friendly format for people that they're familiar with. And they also have their more developer-focused tools like SQL reporting services and other elements like that. So those are some of the most commonly used big players, but it is definitely a market that's evolving and has a lot of ones who may not be quite as big, but are also very strong tools with a good niche in the market.
Yeah, absolutely. So it just sounds like there's a number of offerings on the market right now, which means more availability and innovation for those looking for tools to support their digital transformations too. So we're going to have a short break, but when we do come back, we're going to dive further into business intelligence and the human side of automation. So stick around and we'll be right back.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the 2021 Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us, or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how to take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Welcome back to the Digital Stratosphere podcast. I'm Sarah Dogovich, speaking with Brian LaCarrubba of Third Stage Consulting on the topic of business intelligence. And without further ado, let's jump right back in, shall we? So we started off our discussion with the definition of business intelligence and how it can be a powerful force for digital transformation. Now, let's talk about the human side of the business intelligence equation. So they say a good carpenter is only as good as his tools. So how does this translate to implementing business intelligence tools?
So as we talked about earlier, Sarah, the key is having the changes in behavior that you need as an organization that your data and your access to information is going to enable. So you really need to be able to put people in a position to make decisions based on the right information, and be able to access that in a way that fits into the way that they do their jobs on a day-to-day basis. And that's going to have to change too. You often have, going into a business intelligence initiative, people who have been used to doing things a certain way for a long time, and they've gotten very competent about working around the limitations of their system and their data and making their own intuitions and interpretations of what they know and what they see. But now you're going to be asking them to rely on better information that's aggregated across different sources to be able to pull that. So people need to have those tools that are going to help them to be able to do that, but you also need to help support them in making that transition of understanding that the need that a lot of what they may have done before using their experience and knowledge is something that's now going to be served up to them, and that they need to adapt the way that they use that information, and they'll be able to do a lot more with it, but it is a change of behavior that they need to adapt.
Absolutely. And BI is shaping future workforces by automating many manual tasks. But I think it's important to note that these technologies still depend on humans to pull meaning from insights and transform that knowledge into action. So knowing this, what can we expect the workforce to look like in the near future? And how can organizations ease the transition as some workers' roles take on a new shape?
Well, connected to what we just talked about, it's something that people and knowledge workers are going to have to get more and more comfortable with having data that they trust and being able to rely on the information in front of them to be able to then make decisions based on that point. And obviously that goes hand in hand with the idea you need to give people data that they can trust. You need to give people a reason that they can trust it. But assuming that you do that, and that's a big assumption, but that's a key part of an initiative. If you can get that right information to people, they need to be able to work from that starting point of knowing what's in that data, how they can interpret it to serve their customers, to serve their other stakeholders, and be able to get really comfortable with the idea of relying on drawing insights from the actionable data that's put in front of them. And you're always still going to need the people there who are going to need to connect dots that the data is not going to do on its own, that are going to be able to know what they're hearing from their customers, know what they're hearing from their teammates, and be able to make sense of those inputs as well as what they're getting from their data.
Awesome. Absolutely. Totally agree. And one aspect of digital transformation that often goes neglected is organizational change management. So for example, helping employees navigate changes in processes and technologies. What advice can you give to businesses when it comes to helping people cope with change at the organizational level?
My advice will generally start with the idea that this is a bigger challenge than you think it is. This is, it's easy to, and we've touched on this earlier as well, but it's easy to think that if you get good information in front of people who have been relying on less good information, that they're suddenly going to be able to do their jobs more effectively. But that's not always the case. No matter how good someone is at what they do, and that they're even maybe more so for people who have been doing something for a long time and are very capable in it and they have a lot of pride in their work. They also have a lot of pride in what they've been able to do with the information they have, and of developing their processes and their day-to-day routines around the information that's in front of them. So there are going to be a lot of shifts that often need to be made for people to get used to doing things in a very different way, and to be starting from a different point of having some of the data in front of them that they've been putting a lot of time and effort into interpreting for themselves in the past. So, and then you making different decisions and being able to be a little bit more strategic in the way they're acting based on the data that they have in front of them, that gives them the capability to look across the organization in different ways, to draw conclusions about perhaps different product lines, different views of the customer that they may see from having aggregated data across different areas of the company.
Awesome. Great advice. And if you were to say, like, make a BI checklist for organizations interested in getting started with BI technologies, what would your top 3 steps be?
Start with strategic alignment, making sure that as an organization, you have agreement on what the business goals of your program are. This is, again, it's not a technology project, it's a business project. So make sure you're focused on what are your goals. Data governance, we've talked a lot about. Make sure that you have a plan in place and you're actively working towards ensuring data quality within your organization. And change management, again, touching on the theme we just addressed. People are going to need to do things differently to achieve your BI objectives. So you need to be able to give them the tools to help support them in that effort.
Fantastic. Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing those insights with us. And I'm definitely sure that this episode has given many business leaders a lot to think about when it comes to developing their own digital strategies. So as you are a walking encyclopedia of digital transformation knowledge, do you have any suggestions or suggested resources for those looking to dig deeper into business intelligence?
Sure, I can mention a couple of resources that I like to use. One of them is TDWI, or Transforming Data with Intelligence. They've been around for some time and have a lot of good knowledge and resources available for people. One who also is one of the players in the software space that I didn't talk about is SAS. They've been on the leading edge of analytics for a long time, and they have a lot of advanced tools as well as some more basic information as well. So they're a great resource for information. But of course, another option I would recommend is Third Stage Consulting. You know, we can certainly help you out in terms of how your business intelligence initiative should be connecting to your overall transformation objectives.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Brian, for sharing all your expertise with us today. That's been amazing.
You're welcome. I'm happy to be a part of this.
Absolutely. And that is a wrap for this episode. So I want to thank you, Brian, again for being here, and for all of you for listening. And again, my name is Sarah Dokovic, and we'll see you next time on the next episode of the Digital Stratosphere podcast.
All right. Thank you, Brian and Sarah. Appreciate that. Great conversation on business intelligence, an often overlooked aspect of transformation. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're actually going to play you a clip from one of the keynote sessions that I gave at our Digital Stratosphere conference just a few weeks ago. You can check that out right after the break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology-agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstageconsulting.com.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. Happy to have you here today, and we're excited for this next segment, where we're going to actually play you a keynote session from our Digital Stratosphere conference. And this is a session I've given many times in the past. But what are your thoughts on this particular topic, Kyler, that we're going to tee up here today?
Yeah, I think when we were going through day one, this piece, and we got feedback from our audience that this was the most really well packaged session with actual tactics. A lot of our other sessions talked about the importance of different subjects and gave recommendations, sure, but this one was really an overhaul of how to ensure that your digital transformation was successful. And I know you were joined by some of your actual project team as well, that kind of gave input on actual clients that they were working with. And best practices there too. So definitely, I think this is a great one to share at any point in your digital transformation. If you're just, considering it, or, well into the implementation phase, there's a little bit of something for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And you make a good point too, that it was a co-presentation with Adam Cheatham from our team, who is a director of strategy and transformation at the company, and who you happen to be married to, by the way, for the audience that doesn't know that.
I do know him, yeah.
Yeah, and if you listen very carefully, you might just hear the faint sound of Adam in the background when you're talking.
Rumbling in the background, yeah.
But yeah, and that's a good presentation that he and I both give to different clients and whatnot. And he has some good examples in presentation. And I think, too, this is a good... this presentation was intended to be sort of not a capstone, but more of an introductory session for executives especially, or people that just don't know a ton about transformation or what to expect. This is meant to be sort of a flyover summary of what are the steps and tactics that you should be taking or thinking about as part of your transformation.
Yeah, definitely. And just to remind our audience, this was actually the closing presentation for day one. So if you want to see the full day one presentation, it's available on our website and then also on our YouTube channel as well. And as Eric said, we'll put some links up there so you can see each session in its entirety. And then always, we'd love to hear your feedback. I think a lot of times people don't understand how approachable Eric and the Third Stage executive team are. They love to hear from the audience when it comes to topics or questions. They truly are incredibly passionate about this work. And I know that, and being married to one of your directors as well, about how they really do care about their clients. So if you do have feedback or questions, please feel free to pop them in the comments, or you can definitely reach out to Eric directly or myself as well. I'm happy to field any of those too.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that. And we've included contact information for myself and for you in the description below in this podcast description. So feel free to reach out if you have questions on anything we talk about in this podcast or transformation in general. So good deal. Well, we'll go ahead and cue this up then. And so here is the executive summary of digital transformation best practices keynote session that Adam Cheatham and I delivered at Stratosphere a few weeks ago. We'll go ahead and cut to that right now. This is a presentation that Adam and I often give to new clients and or executive teams and new clients, just to help them understand, if we have to give you a summary view of what it's going to take to be successful in a project and what it's going to take to navigate some of the pitfalls and avoid some of the failure points that Marcus talked about earlier today. What are those things? And really building on both what Marcus and Stuart talked about earlier, as well as what I talked about in the opening session. So we want to just provide an executive summary of transformation best practices. And Adam, chime in at any point, add color commentary, cut me off, and certainly anyone else who wants to jump in and interrupt with questions, or first of all, you're not interrupting, but hopefully you know what I mean. Just chime in with any chat questions you have in the chat box there, either on whatever platform you're watching this on. And I'm keeping an eye here on LinkedIn as well for anyone that might have comments on LinkedIn that's watching there. So the first thing to understand is diving a little bit deeper into understanding what is digital transformation. What is that overview of what digital transformation is? And we've talked a lot about this between Stuart's presentation and mine, just some of the emerging technologies, the different buzzwords and acronyms and types of technology that are being used in digital transformation. I guess the short summary, without rehashing everything that Stuart just talked about, there's a lot of stuff out there. There's a lot of technology emerging. There's a lot of options when it comes to digital transformation. Digital transformation can mean a lot of different things to different people and to different organizations. And it should mean different things to different organizations. It should align with what it is you're trying to accomplish. And that's one of the keys to keep in mind. And there is no one size fits all answer. There's no cookie cutter approach. There's no silver bullet. I mean, hopefully that's a theme that you're picking up on here with us and our technology agnostic view of the world, is that, what might work for one organization doesn't make sense for another organization, and vice versa. So we've got to figure out what the right path forward is for us as an organization. And one thing that is helpful, though, to understand, and again, there's no right or wrong answer here, is to understand, what is a true digital transformation versus a more of a traditional technology implementation. And in this slide here, we compare, call it your traditional ERP implementation that, would have been relevant 20 years ago, to maybe a more comprehensive, bigger picture view of digital transformation, which is what you see on the right. And again, even though I think the bias here is to assume that digital transformation is better than ERP implementation or traditional technology implementation, that may or may not be true. It really does just depend on what it is you're trying to accomplish. For a lot of organizations, doing a more incremental improvement or upgrade to their existing ERP system or their enterprise technologies can make a lot of sense, especially if what you've got is a pretty good starting point, especially if you're risk adverse, especially if you have other competing priorities that you don't want to throw in a big, massive transformation in the middle of. Then a more incremental ERP implementation can make a lot of sense. For other organizations, maybe on the other extreme, you're going to have more massive external impacts that might force you into a transformation. So for example, you look at industries such as retail that's being disrupted significantly, or was already being disrupted significantly, and then COVID came along and disrupted it even more. And retail is a good example of an industry that if they haven't digitally transformed yet, they're way behind, and they're being forced to in that space. And so most organizations are going to be somewhere in the middle. They're going to be somewhere between, small incremental baby steps and big, massive transformation. Most organizations are going to be in the spectrum or the continuum, somewhere in the middle. So the key here is to understand, what is the difference between the two extremes, and most importantly is to really have clarity and definition of what exactly it is where we fall on the continuum. And that's really the key. Is if there's one takeaway I could leave you with on this slide, it's just be sure you understand what it is you're trying to accomplish. Are you trying to accomplish an incremental, call it traditional ERP technology upgrade or implementation? Or are you really trying to swing for the fences and really look for ways to improve your processes significantly, and to rethink your business model, and to standardize processes or to integrate processes? Whatever the goals and objectives are, those are all the things that you want to try to make sure you have alignment and clarity on. Now, when you look through each of the line items here, with the technology, the process management, change management, business value, all the row headings that you see on the left, you can see what the differences are between the two. And again, there's no right or wrong answer. It's just a matter of being clear about where it is you are, and making sure your team's clear about where it is you fall on this continuum, and then defining a path forward that aligns with that clarity. So I mentioned in the first presentation today that one of the biggest challenges, or one of the biggest root causes of failure, is lack of alignment and misalignment as an organization. And this is a good example of how teams oftentimes get really misaligned. They go in thinking that, for example, they'll go in thinking that, hey, we're going to do this big, massive digital transformation. We're going to implement enterprise-wide technology. We're going to rethink our business processes. We're going to reimagine the art of the possible, and all these big buzzwords that industry analysts and us consultants like to throw out there. But then when they go to plan and execute, they treat it like an ERP implementation. They plan as though they're managing a more traditional ERP upgrade. And that right there, you're starting out of the gates with misalignment, and you've got an unrealistic view of what the path forward really should be versus what it is. And you can see how quickly you get pretty tangled up, and your team's going to get tangled up, and it can be very difficult to succeed in that kind of environment when you have those sort of headwinds working against you. So that's one of the big challenges that we see, in this. And so that's probably the big takeaway here, is just really understand what it is you're trying to accomplish between ERP implementation, digital transformation, or somewhere in between, and getting alignment on what that means to the overall transformation and the overall plan.
I think something that's important on that to note as well is that from an ERP implementation perspective, that's a bit more of a prescriptive technological solution, whereas the digital transformation is something that should be ongoing. You should always be transforming your business to remain at the forefront of your industry, and is a bit more driven towards what the organization and your business needs, as opposed to a specific solution that would solve a number of your potential digital transformation needs and goals, but shouldn't be the actual answer. So as an enabler, the ERP is the technology that enables a pretty significant chunk of your digital transformation, but isn't the actual transformation itself.
Yeah, great point. And that's an important takeaway there, is to ensure you've got that understanding going in here. The other thing to think about too is what are those challenges of digital transformation? And this is actually a top 5 list based on our research and experience. And we published this in our 2021 digital transformation report, which you can download on our website. And something tells me that Kyla is probably going to put up a link in the chat box, like she has been throughout the whole session here today, so that we'll have a link there for you to potentially do that. But in that study, or in that paper that you'll see, the top challenges that organizations face, and this isn't just our opinion, this is what organizations state and what the project teams are saying are their challenges and issues they face. The number one challenge is change management and managing the people part of the the equation. The second thing is misalignment with strategic objectives. And that's the key that we were just talking about on the previous slide, just making sure that there's a good deal of clarity on what those strategic objectives are and how this transformation lines up with that. And then number 3 is managing the system integrator and making sure that you don't view the system integrator as an end-all be-all, as a one-stop shop, because they really aren't. They may be a one-stop shop in terms of the technology work stream, but when you look at the business process and the organizational change work streams, that's typically areas that system integrators are not very well versed in, or if they do have competencies in that area, it's very superficial and it's very much focused on the technology and how to use the technology versus how to transform the business and define business processes and that sort of thing. So that difficulty managing the system integrator is a big challenge. And then number 4 is clarity of business processes, making sure that you have clarity around what those business processes are going to be. And then 5th is difficulties with data migration. So those are really the top 5 challenges that organizations face. And I'm getting some comments here that the slide is blurry, and there is a lot of text here, a lot going on here, but hopefully you can at least read the bullet or the bolded areas. And if not, I've verbalized for you what those 5 things are. And again, we'll make sure you have a link, or you do have a link here in the chat box. If you want to download that report, you can actually see this exact graphic in that report. So if you want to check that, that's probably going to be easier for you to read or refer back to. And it actually goes into more detail on these 5 areas as well in that report. So if you're watching here on Crowdcast, just be sure you click that link to get the report. So one thing I'll note here is that none of these 5 things, except for maybe the 5th one, the data migration one, really have anything to do with the technology or the software itself. These are all issues related to business processes, organizational change, and I'd call it project governance as well. So just food for thought there as you think about where are you most likely going to run into trouble. I heard Marcus say, yeah, you sometimes do have issues with technology, and you can certainly find a way to mess that up if you start to customize software, if you don't really think things through or test the software. You can certainly run into issues there. But back to a point I made in the first session, it's usually fairly black and white or relatively black and white on the technology side. Either the technology works or it doesn't from a technical perspective. But the gray area comes down to, yes, it works technically, but does it work for our business, for our organization? And that gray area is where most organizations struggle, where most organizations don't spend enough time and money. And so it's really a matter of maybe shifting your mindset a little bit to focus more on those other areas. And then another challenge that we see is that in that same report, in that same link that you see that Kyla provided here, you can see that one of the biggest challenges that organizations face is this whole concept of operational disruption. So we spend so much time thinking about what is our cost of implementation? How long is it going to take? How much of people's time is it going to take? And we tend to try to optimize or minimize that amount of time or that amount of time and that overall cost without thinking about the longer term implications. Yes, we could certainly cut costs and reduce the implementation duration and reduce the amount of impact that this has to our resources during the implementation. We could always do that. But the question becomes, but what does that do longer term to our total cost of ownership, the total cost of the implementation, either because we had to fix things that went wrong in the implementation in the first time, or what's even more costly is when you have this operational disruption where, yep, we went live, but we couldn't ship product. We couldn't close the books. We couldn't invoice customers. We couldn't collect cash, whatever the problem statement is. A lot of organizations run into that sort of challenge. And in fact, in our research over the years, and this actually goes back over a decade, we've managed this, or we've measured this one metric of what is the operational disruption, and just over 50%, between 51 and 54%, it's always fallen in that range every year we've conducted the study. Just over half experienced some sort of material operational disruption, not just your usual, it was a little bit harder than we thought, or it took us a little bit of time to get used to the new system. We're not talking about that. We're talking about we couldn't ship product. We couldn't close the books. There's some major disruption to our business. And half of organizations are facing that problem when they go live with new technology. And when you look at what the impact to the overall total cost is, or how much that operational disruption costs relative to the cost of the actual implementation itself, usually when there is that sort of operational disruption, those costs will dwarf the cost of the implementation itself. So, I think back to early in my career, one of the first projects that I had managed from soup to nuts, from selection all the way through implementation, was for a mid-sized manufacturer in the U.S., and they had European operations as well. So a multinational mid-sized organization, manufacturer of engineer to order or make to order types of products. They made pressure gauges and pressure gauges for like oil pipelines and gas pipelines and water mains and things like that. And they had implemented a manufacturing ERP solution. I remember that there was a couple decision points along the way where we had decided to, or we had recommended that they push out the go live because they had decided to do a bunch of customization to address some of the unique factors of their business, and that was pushing the timeline out. And I remember it was the second time the go live had been shifted. It had already been shifted 2 times, and we were recommending a third shift by 30 days to push it out 30 days to make sure we had time to finish the testing and to get through the wrinkles in the system that they were deploying. And the CEO, I still remember the CEO said, "Look, we've got to cut our losses. We've got to stop the bleeding. This is taking too long, taking too much time and money. We need to just go live." And, of course, we recommended, okay, we don't recommend you do that. Here are the risks, just to make sure you're aware of the risks. And they said, okay, we get it, but we still want to go live. So long story short, we helped them through the go live, and it was a mess. They went live, and at the end of the day, they lost so many customer orders that they're about $100 million US company in annual revenue. They had lost, and when I say lost, I don't mean like it just took them a little bit longer to fill the order, or they had to delay these orders. They actually lost over $10 million of orders in those first 2 to 3 months after go live. And so you look at the cost, take the profit margin on whatever that $10 million of sales was, call it, 1 or 2 million in lost profit. You compare that to what was going to be about, if I remember correctly, somewhere between $60,000 and $70,000 it would have cost to extend the go live, that extra 30 days to go through the diligence and the testing. So they made that trade-off, or that conscious decision, that we want to save that $60,000 or $70,000. So they did do that. They gained that $60,000 or $70,000, but they lost however many millions of dollars in profit on that. Lost $10 million in sales. So that's the way you kind of have to think about this. Is it's never an easy answer, and there's never a good answer when you get into those types of situations. But you do want to make sure you have a clear understanding of what the real impact is to the organization, and the real cost as well. And then, the variables that had the strongest impact on operational disruption, just in case you can't read the box on the right there, the biggest variables were clarity of business processes. Those that have tighter, better defined processes tended to have less operational disruption. Those that invested in change management tended to have less operational disruption. Those that had alignment among the executives and key stakeholders had less disruption, as did those that spent time and effort on the user acceptance testing and conference room pilots, and making sure they almost over invested in that process to make sure they worked out all the kinks and the wrinkles. And again, there's a big difference between the technology working and the system integrator delivering a working system from a technical perspective versus one that actually works for your business and it can actually function within your business. Those are two very different things oftentimes.
Yeah, and Eric, it looks like we have some questions specifically on budgeting for organizational change management. Can you talk about how you might do that within this process?
Sure. We get that question a lot, and that's a tough one to answer because I don't have a hard and fast metric. Typically, what we do is we'll go in and do an organizational assessment to figure out, what is the culture of the organization, how big is the change? Because obviously, if it's a bigger change, that's going to require more organizational change management. How quickly are you trying to make the change? How willing and able and skilled are your people in migrating to that change? those are all things that affect the amount of time and money and effort it's going to take to invest in change management. But a good metric that I've used, and I think I've seen this from, I don't remember if it's Gartner or one of the big industry analyst firms. I thought I'd seen in the past, and I've always had it in my mind for the last several years, it's somewhere between 15 and 20% of the total budget should be invested in change management. And what you find is it's usually a tiny fraction of that. I mean, oftentimes you're lucky to get a couple percentage points of a total budget on the overall implementation. But what I would say though, here's the other thing: you hear post-mortem, you often hear clients complain about, they spent too much time and money on the project. Oftentimes we spent too much time and money just trying to get the technology configured and customized and tested and all that stuff. But I've never heard a client say, yeah, we spent way too much money on change management. It's usually we should have spent more on that and less on the technology. So the more you can simplify some of the technology work streams and focus more on the human pieces, I'd rather take a underwhelming technical solution, but have a really good change management solution. That's probably going to be a better bet than trying to swing for the fences on the technology side, but then under investing in the human side.
I would agree with that. The overall point here is to enable your business to function more effectively, and it's a far better scenario to implement bad software very well than it is to implement very good software poorly.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of what complicates that point, Adam, is that vendors and system integrators they're selling you on this vision of what their technology can do and how great the technology is. And back to Stuart's presentation and even mine at the very beginning of today, you kind of look long-term what things could be like 10 years from now. And then you try to cram that all into a 12 or 18 month implementation. It's just not going to happen. So you've got to figure out how do we maybe back off those expectations and say, okay, that might be where we're going to be in 10 years, but in 2 years, we might just be happy automating our, getting some real simple GL and accounting software in place. Maybe that's okay. Maybe that's a, good risk reward trade-off there.
Yeah. And we've got 2 questions about defining processes, judging whether or not processes are defined well enough, and then also with how important are edge cases in the process design. Those are kind of intertwined, I would say. And Eric, I'd be curious as to what your thoughts are here too. But from a perspective of defining your current state before your implementations, not quite as necessary as the detail that you get into in defining your processes in the implementation. And every possible scenario should be accommodated in a system or known that it's not going to be in the system. From a you can call them edge cases, you can call them exceptions. Your ERP, you don't choose one and implement it for the happy path in your business processes. So having everything down to the nittiest grittiest detail is really important to being successful in your implementation on the whole, and not just creating it in that space, but also implementing it down to that and testing it down to that space with real data is really how you get to the point of the highest degree of success in your business processes and in going live and testing those edge cases with real data, knowing where some of them are. You're always going to have unknown unknowns that come up throughout the process, but knowing that you're getting everything and getting coverage of the whole of your business is really critical to success, because it's very frequently the edge cases that cause the biggest breakages.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes those edge cases can bring the operations to its knees, or depending on what it is or how customer facing it is, of course. But that's a good point. And you're never going to cover every single exception or scenario. There's always curveballs that you get in your day-to-day operations. But if they're known curveballs or known exceptions or things that are difficult, or where you have some sort of unique workaround right now, I agree with you. That's what's going to mess things up or tangle things up when you get into a real world environment. And the question here about how do you know if the processes are defined enough? I think Liam asked that question around how do you know if they're defined enough? The way I always think about it is, I'm not sure if anyone on the conference here today is familiar with that level 1 through 5 methodology or nomenclature for business process definition. But to simplify it, it's, level 1 is sort of your macro process at a real high level. Level 5 is getting down to the real granular keystroke transactional workflows. And then levels, 2 through 4 kind of incrementally working their way down to level 5 level of detail. But when you're evaluating technology, usually you're kind of at that level 1 and 2. You're up at the macro level. You're defining your business processes in a way that's helping you evaluate and choose the right technology that's the best fit. You don't want to get down to level 3, 4, 5 because that's dependent on what technology you deploy. But when you selected the software and then you start moving into implementation, what ends up happening is the system integrator generally wants to dive straight down into level 5. So they're just trying to figure out, okay, how do I build these workflows in the system and start training people on the workflows? But then you miss that middle part. So usually when we do the implementation readiness or that pre-implementation planning, we suggest getting a little bit deeper, maybe down to level 2 and 3 level of granularity, just so you have a pretty clear blueprint of how you want the technology to be deployed. And then you have better direction to give to your system integrator on, kind of here's our roadmap or here's our blueprint for what we want. Now let's fill in the blanks of how the technology is going to fit within that. And let's reconcile where maybe the technology can't support that. But at least then you have a clear blueprint for where you want to go. So I think that's an important step that gets missed more often than not. And that creates a level of misalignment too, because if your transactional workflows down here are working, but they're not aligned with those high level macro business processes, you need to connect those dots and get them aligned in the middle there. Those are good questions. So with that being said, let's dive into what are those keys to transformation success. And there's actually 8 of them that we'll cover. And these are the sort of the high level themes that you may have picked up on, or we may have alluded to throughout other presentations. And some of this may be new. But the first thing to keep in mind, or the first tip, if we're to summarize 8 things for sort of an executive level executive summary, is that first of all, failure can be avoided. Even though the statistics are pretty dismal, even though a lot of research shows that upwards of 80% of transformations fail. I just shared with you the statistic that over half of implementations suffer from some sort of material operational disruption. It may sound like it's sort of a lost cause. It's just we're doomed for failure. We're doomed for all this pain. And the reality is it's not true. I mean, it shouldn't be a surprise to most organizations that go through failure, but it ends up being a surprise because they're not well educated. They've been misled by their system integrator or their vendor, or they just don't know any better. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why they're surprised by it, but they shouldn't be. If they just educate themselves and understand lessons from others and understand what some of the key themes for success are, then they will succeed. And usually you can tell by looking at a number of different criteria. You can sort of tell whether or not a project's going to be a success or failure. Now, granted, not to say that there's situations where there's never challenges. Every project has its challenges and tough points in the project, but usually you can tell those that are going to succeed versus the ones that fail based on what they're doing. And a lot of those decisions are made early in the transformation project. So that's probably the first big takeaway there is to understand that piece of it. Okay, we're going to take a quick break, and we're going to come back after the break, and we'll finish up this keynote session. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control. We'll be right back.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. We go live every Wednesday on YouTube, all the podcast platforms like Google and Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc. Thanks for listening. And we're talking right now, we're replaying for you a clip from a keynote session that we did at our Digital Stratosphere conference about executive summary of best practices. in digital transformations. So we're going to cut back to that, and we'll finish up the second half of that presentation right now. The second thing is to start with a clear digital strategy. It's easy to rush into the software selection and or the implementation, but you want to make sure you have a clear vision for what it is you're trying to accomplish with the project. Are you doing this just as a technology upgrade? Per the earlier slide around digital transformation versus technology implementation. Where are you on that continuum? So have a clear long-term strategy and roadmap and understanding of what it is you're going to do to get to that long-term state of utopia that we were talking about earlier today. And again, if that state of utopia is something that's 10 years out or 5 years out or whatever it is, don't try to make that leap all at once. Too many organizations just try to make that leap because they've been sold a vision that could be allegedly be executed within 12 to 18 months or whatever the number is. But you need to be realistic about it and really understand incrementally how are we going to get there over the next however many years.
And in this space, you also want to, in defining your digital strategy and the goals that you're trying to get from this, knowing which ones which ones are more urgent and which ones require a little bit of building is important. The two examples I like to use in this space is, I don't know how many folks that are on green screen technology it come to me with one of the first things that they ask for is advanced business analytics, advanced business intelligence. And you ask them, why do you want this? Like, well, I can't pull my finance reports out of this green screen system, so I need advanced technology to do this. What you need is financial reporting, not advanced BI yet. Like, let's see what it is comes out of the box as opposed to going straight to the most advanced stuff. Because advanced BI is, it's very cool. It does a lot of things and will enable you to make great decisions for your business. But without the right approach to it, you could overpay significantly for advanced business intelligence for just needing to close the books in less than 4 weeks, or just needing to be able to pull your financial statements without having to take 6 different sources, pull them into Excel and manipulate them. That's not advanced business intelligence. That's financial reporting. That's something that what we'd like to recommend is in that space, you replace what's there and what you need out of the box as close as possible, and then see if you need some of the more advanced technology, or did you actually get what you needed out of things once you know more about what it is you're biting off. The other part of this from a longer term perspective is things like MRP. I know Stuart was sharing the example with the Christmas trees, right? MRP is an intelligent process that's predictive, is based on demand planning, has a lot of inputs. And for something to be, for MRP to be predictive, it needs data. And your green screen data is going to be really hard for your MRP to really create a lot of value from. So if you're not running an MRP today, or it's not advanced, you may think about implementing that in a later phase as part of your digital strategy, so that you have time to get new, accurate, and very good data into your system. So then your MRP and demand planning modules can start making more predictive and effectively predictive recommendations for purchasing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of reminds me of the whole need to make sure you've got a clear understanding of what exactly you're getting. There's a lot of buzzwords floating around, but just making sure you translate that into what it's going to mean to your organization, how it's going to fit within your organization. And if it doesn't, then you have to ask yourself, well, why are we doing it? Just because they have this technology capability available to us doesn't mean we necessarily need to be deploying it, or at least not now. And speaking of that, that's a good segue into this next point, which is to let business drive the technology. The most successful projects that we've seen are the ones where it wasn't just IT leading the charge. It was more of a business focused initiative. Even if it was the CIO or IT director as the executive sponsor, or even if you did have a technical project manager internally, you still had some sort of strong business focus that treated IT more as an enabler of the business change, rather than assuming that IT was going to define for the business how the technology was going to fit within the business. So that's a really important point, because a lot of times we see a lot of businesses where the operational side will assume that the IT guy or gal is just going to take care of this, and the whole team on the IT side is going to take care of it, and just tell us what you need, and we'll support you along the way. And really, it should be flipped around. It should be the business driving. This is what we need. This is how we want to define our processes. This is what we want to be when we grow up. Now let's figure out how technology is going to fit into that, rather than the other way around. And also, you want to make sure that the transformation is closely aligned with measurable goals and just overall objectives of the organization. You know, we talk about organizational misalignment being a root cause of failure. A lot of times it's because the way we've defined a digital transformation isn't consistent with what we're trying to accomplish as a business. So I'll just give you an example. A lot of times we see cases where the executive or the strategic goal is to, standardize business processes to drive efficiency and to move toward more of a shared service model where we're consolidating functions and we're starting to act like, one common business with one common operating model across multiple locations. But then you get down to the digital transformation, and the path of least resistance oftentimes is to not do that, because that's painful to do those things. And so let's just sort of pave the cow paths and put technology in place in a way that's going to just enable the way we've always done things, or the way we're doing things now. And not to open a whole nother can of worms or Pandora's box here, that we could probably create a whole session on this one comment or this one thread. But I think the whole agile movement has actually made this problem worse, because now now in the name of agile, we're just going to go start doing stuff. And I know I'm oversimplifying. I'm probably offending a certain number of people in the audience today, but that's not the intent. The intent here is to look more strategically at, yes, we can go execute from an agile perspective, but when it comes to defining and planning what we want to be when we grow up and what our processes should look like, that just takes time. And agile runs counter to that. Agile says, don't spend a lot of time up front doing that. Just go build stuff and get a minimum viable product. And let's just start making some progress and getting some quick wins. Well, okay, we can get a lot of quick wins along the way, but we could be going in the totally wrong direction, getting quick wins along the way. So we've got to make sure we're going the right direction, and we have that alignment with the overall strategy. So just some food for thought as you think about how are we going to treat this project? How are we going to plan for it? What's our strategy? How are we going to put together the plan? All that good stuff. The other another thread here is to set realistic expectations. I mentioned before in the last session, or the first session from today, that unrealistic expectations are often the root causes of problems later on. And again, the phenomena we see, or the dynamic we see in place there, is that you box in your project with some unrealistic assumptions. You assume it's going to take less time, money, and resources, and you assume it's going to be less risky than it really is going to be. And then you get into the implementation after everyone's on board with those assumptions. You get into the project or halfway through the project and realize that this isn't going to work. This was never realistic to begin with, and now we need more time and money, or we have to dramatically cut scope or cut corners just to be able to fit within this, flawed budget and timeline. So that's the big thing that we've got to keep in mind, is that you want to have those realistic expectations. And the biggest word of advice I can give is that last bullet there, which is when you get proposals from vendors, you don't want to distrust them, but you also want to ask a lot of questions, like how in the world are we going to migrate all of our data in a week, or whatever the assumption might be in their plan or in their proposal. And also look for things that aren't in their proposal that are important to the success of the project and should be built into your overall plan. So if you think of it as an overall program plan that you're managing, the technical implementer, the system integrator, or the vendor is just one part of that. So to put all your eggs in that one basket, to say whatever proposal they give me, that's what I'm going to budget on, that's flawed from the start, even if they're not being overly optimistic, because they haven't included all the other things that you're responsible for. So you're probably going to be responsible for data migration. You're probably going to be responsible for change management. You're probably going to be responsible for defining your business processes, for integrating to third-party systems. These are all things that are super critical to the project, but they typically don't build that into their plans, or if they have, it's very superficial, very tertiary at best. And add to that the fact that usually they're overly optimistic on their own work stream, and you can see how quickly you're going to end up with an unrealistic set of expectations if you don't ask the tough questions, and if you don't have the people, unbiased, agnostic people helping you that can help identify where those gaps are and where the dose of reality needs to be added.
And to elaborate on that a bit more, I think that from a vendor perspective, and there's a lot of conversations that we have on this that we should give them some credit. They know what their system can do, and there's a confirmation bias in that. They've seen their system do all kinds of things. They know it can do just about anything, but that doesn't mean that they know that it can do it well or better than anybody else's, or without the significant degree of customization, or that just because they think it can happen doesn't always mean that it can in that system in that way either. So that confirmation bias is really part of what causes a lot of those problems, in my opinion. And from a perspective of taking things with a grain of salt and setting realistic expectations, for Rajan's question on artificial intelligence in ERP versus built-in products or other tools like Power BI, what are your expectations? The answer to which is better is what's the better fit for you. If your expectations are that it is going to do quite a lot of AI-based number crunching and decision making for you, then Power BI is not going to be able to handle that. But if it's something that is more aligned towards the business intelligence skill sets, key performance indicators, maybe a smaller software package is realistic. So think about your needs and how it is your expectations are set and what it is you're looking for software to do to meet those needs.
Yeah, really, really good points. And couldn't agree more with you. I also like Richard's comment here. I think I mentioned something about a grain of salt, and he said grain, question mark, or big pile. And that is a way to look at it. I know you might be half kidding on that comment, but you do have to, you do have to accept it for what it is when you get these proposals and these proposed budgets and timelines. Is they're trying to make a sale, and that's just human nature. Even if you assume the best in people, you have to assume that the human nature is they want to make the sale, and they're not going to risk alarming you as a potential customer. So another point here is that implementation is more important than selection. That's one of the big findings we see with clients. It's easy to get overwhelmed with all the options out there. It's easy to get caught up in analysis paralysis. We see it all the time, especially when you get more stakeholders involved. And, on one hand, from a change management and buy-in perspective, you want people to be involved in the decision and the evaluation process. But on the other hand, that complicates things. That can slow down the decision-making process because you're never going to get all of your questions answered. You're never going to feel 100% comfortable with whatever solution or solutions you end up wanting to go with. And so you really have to find that balance between, we want buy-in, we want to do our due diligence, but we also don't want to spend way too much time and money thinking through this stuff. Because what ends up happening a lot of times is that, again, the analysis paralysis sets in, and you reach a point of diminishing returns where you're never going to be fully confident and comfortable. And now we're just wasting time and money that we could be spending on the actual implementation. So if we view resources as being finite, which it is for most organizations, you really have to think about, every day and week and month that we go on without a decision, or that we spend trying to overanalyze, overthink a process, or worse yet, evaluate systems that we shouldn't have been evaluating in the first place because it's just not a good fit. It doesn't, there's key requirements that we have that isn't going to be met by this technology. So why are we spending our time evaluating it? That ends up happening a lot too. So the quicker you can get through an educated and agnostic and informed evaluation and get to a decision, and then start to really focus and double down on the implementation itself, that's going to serve you a lot better. If you can have a really strong implementation on a subpar software, that's going to be a much better bet than having 100% confidence that you found the perfect technology, but then now you don't have enough time and money to implement it appropriately.
And on that, I would say that your selection, as long as your selection is enabling your implementation on the whole, where you're really starting to think future state and prepare for your implementation and treat it almost like an extension of your readiness phase, that's really the best way to use a software selection, so that you're really getting a lot out of what it is you're doing to select the system, but it's not just focused on the sheer purpose of determining whether or not you should go with one versus another, but is also gaining some additional value in the way that you'll be more ready to start. People will be engaged. Your processes can be a bit more well defined. If you're really going to go big in the selection phase, it is more important to implement well than select well, but you should also consider that you can really get some great synergy on your readiness activities in using your selection phase to be a double-edged tool for you.
Yeah, that's a great point. You don't have to necessarily wait until you get through the selection to then think about change management, or then think about a rollout strategy and all that stuff.
Well, so many of the change management tactics, data, process improvements, you don't need software for those. You can evaluate that and get that in place, and it will make your implementation go far more smoothly, and you'll start reaping benefits earlier as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You knock out some of those critical path activities sooner. I think we've hit this point several times throughout multiple presentations today, so I won't spend a lot of time here, but there's no silver bullets. Watch out for the silver bullets. Be leery of it. Be skeptical. Sometimes I feel like that old Saturday Night Live skit with Debbie Downer, where she, someone will be talking about how they had a great time at Disneyland or whatever, and then she steps in and starts complaining about the risk of going on amusement park rides and stuff like that. If you haven't seen the skit, that's the gist of Debbie Downer. And they do it in a lighthearted way, but you kind of have to act like Debbie Downer when it comes to the over optimism that comes at you from the software vendors and system integrators. And that, healthy dose of skepticism will serve you well, just to, not assume that just because the technology is great, that it's going to be easy. Probably the best example is cloud deployments. I think that's one of the most oversold movements in the industry, even though the whole industry, as we talked about before, is moving to the cloud. And I'm not disputing the benefit of the cloud, but what I am disputing is this whole notion that cloud deployments are somehow easier, they're cheaper, they're faster, because they're just simply not. If anything, the way cloud deployments have been going recently, with some of these relatively immature cloud solutions being rolled out to organizations by really big software vendors, it's actually complicating things more, to where, I would argue it could potentially be increasing time and cost for transformation. So, really watch out for that silver bullet mentality, which is, it's what we all want to hear, so it's understandable. I want to hear that there's an easy button out there. I want to hear that a cloud solution is super easy to deploy. I want to hear that my people aren't going to resist this change, and that they're just going to love this technology. That's all stuff I want to hear. But what I want to hear versus reality are oftentimes very different when it comes to these transformations. And probably the most important thing is that, even if you assume the technology itself is easier to deploy for whatever reason, we still haven't addressed the really big problem, which is the people and process side of the equation. Those are always the toughest parts, I should say.
Sometimes faster is not better on that. There you go. So actually, you can go to the next one.
Yeah.
Take it. I won't steal too much of your thunder on this, but sometimes faster is more expensive. And you rush into creating more problems than solving them by moving more quickly. So I'll back off for a second here for you to get to the slide, Eric.
No, that's perfect. You're more than welcome to steal my thunder anytime. Yeah. I think you hit the point here, that it's I think there's a fine line here between going fast and being aggressive in your implementation or in your overall project. You can do that if you have a solid plan and you're aligned and you've got clear direction. The problem is, too often you run into this dynamic where we've selected the software, we've signed the contract, the vendors and the system integrators are pressuring us now to bring on the army of people to help you start deploying the technology. And add that to the fact that there's a lot of excitement internally around this decision. Usually momentum's the highest right at the end of the selection phase, right? When you've decided that this is the path forward, that's about as high as momentum's going to ever be in a project. And that's about as high as morale is going to be on your project team. And I hate to say it, but that's typically true. And then from then, then it starts to drop once you start to get it into the headwinds and into the weeds of the what the change actually means and all the nuances that go in with it. So that dynamic oftentimes leads organizations, because they've got so much momentum. People are excited about this new path forward. Vendor and system integrator are pressuring you to get started right away. It leads to this phenomena where we end up bringing in a ton of consultants that are there ready to start building stuff, but we're still trying to figure out, what are we doing here? What are our processes going to be? What are we consolidating? What are we standardizing? What are we not? And while you're making those decisions, the meter is running. You're paying for that time for the consultants to be sitting there waiting for you to decide. So you really want to take a couple steps back to take many steps forward and to be able to move faster later by getting that clear definition of plan in place. To your point, Adam, faster isn't always better, but sometimes you have to start off slow to be able to go faster later. And overall, that can be the faster and cheaper approach.
When it takes time for the system integrator to get their team on board too, right? So one of the biggest challenges is that sales handoff. The folks that you've been talking to most of the time, you might have one or two technical resources that you've been talking to, but you've been talking to the sales guys the whole time, and that handoff takes time. And there's an embedded assumption that because I told the sales guy, everybody at the organization knows what I told them is my most important thing. And it takes time for that message to sink in across your implementation team, your system integrators, and for them to get up and running so that your technical resources understand your business, that there's that knowledge handoff, and trying to rush that part of the implementation from a planning perspective can really start putting people in spots where they're expected to know more than they should yet.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. And then finally, as a preview of the next session, the most important thing is organizational change management, the people side of the equation. Your project will fail without it. I don't think I've ever seen a project succeed that didn't invest really heavily in change management. And even the cases that I've been involved with, or that we've been involved with as a team, where they have invested heavily in change management, there's typically more you could be doing to be doing a better job in that area. And it really comes down to understanding what exactly change management is. And that, again, that's the topic for the next discussion. I just realized, Kyler, we're way over on time, so I apologize. We're throwing off your schedule here. But just at a high level, I think the one thing I'd say, short of getting into the details that we'll cover in the next session, is that change management is a lot more than just training and communications. If your system integrator, your vendor is probably going to suggest a certain amount of communication and training type of activities, which is great, but that is just scratching the surface, and that's stuff that's way downstream. You need to be doing change management from day one, and that includes things like organizational design, the organizational readiness, the change impact analysis, and really targeting the communications along the way, not just what are we doing with this project, and not just when are we going to get trained on the new system. That stuff's important, but what's more important is how is this project going to affect me and my job, and how is it compared to the way I do things today, and how are you going to help me understand that and get to that point? What ends up happening too often is that you get to the training workshops, in class training or whatever it is, and people have their freak out moments in the training. They should be having those freak out moments way earlier in the process, so you can work through it and work through those kinks, so that by the time you get to end user training, it's more of a formality of, okay, I already understand that my job's changing and I understand why, and I've already freaked out. Now you're just going to show me how to do it in the new system. So I'm oversimplifying, but that's sort of the general dynamic that we often see with change management. So make sure you have a real solid investment in change management along the way. Okay, well, hopefully you all enjoyed that segment from our Stratosphere conference a few weeks ago. Kyler, one last time, where can people access that and the other keynotes that we did on that first day of the conference?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's available on our website, and then also on our Third Stage YouTube channel as well. So feel free. And again, my contact information is below. So if you have questions about where to find things, I'm happy to help deliver. Great. Yeah. And for those of you that aren't subscribers to our YouTube channel, just search Third Stage Consulting. When you go into YouTube, you'll find us there.
You can also follow or subscribe to my channel on YouTube, and certainly connect with us on LinkedIn and other social media platforms as well. We post stuff daily, new content, so encourage you to check that out as well. So Kyler, thanks for being here today. This was our first podcast together, so thank you we've done other events together, but this is our first podcast, so thank you for being a great host today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a great time, so I appreciate it.
Absolutely. We'll have you again soon, and we'll have a good rest of your week, Kyler, and everyone else listening, and hope to see you all soon, and we'll see you next time on Transformation Ground Control.